Evening all, welcome to this week. A week in which a bunch of loser jihadists slaughtered 132 innocents in Paris to prove the future belongs to them, rather than a civilization like France. Well, I can't say I fancy their chances. France, the country of Descartes, Boulez, Monet, Sartre, Rousseau, Camus, Renoir, Berlioz, Cézanne, Gauguin, Hugo, Voltaire, Matisse, Debussy, Ravel, Sanson, Bizet, Satie, Pasteur, Molière, Frank, Zola, Balzac, Poulenc, cutting-edge science, world-class medicine, fearsome security forces, nuclear power, Coco Chanel, Chateau Lafite, Coco Van, Daft Punk, Zizou Zidane, Juliette Binoche, liberty, equality, fraternity, and creme brulee. Versus what? Beheadings, crucifixions, amputations, slavery, mass murder, medieval squalor, a death cult barbarity that would shame the Middle Ages. Well, IS or Daesh or ISIS or ISIL or whatever name you're going by, I'm sticking with IS, as in Islamist scumbags. I think the outcome is pretty clear to everybody but you. Whatever atrocities you're currently capable of committing, you will lose. In 1,000 years' time, Paris, that glorious city of lights, will still be shining bright, as will every other city like it, while you will be as dust, along with a ragbag of fascists, Nazis and Stalinists that have previously dared to challenge democracy and failed.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
The first explosion from a suicide bomber was heard at 9:20 during a football match between France and Germany at the Stade de France. It happened near Gate D of the stadium on Rue Rimet. 2 bodies were discovered. One, the suicide bomber wearing a belt of explosives with bolts to worsen the blast. The other deceased person was a bystander. 5 minutes later, a second attack took place at Le Petit Cambodge and Le Carillon restaurants, near the corner of Rue Alibert and Rue Bichat. 15 people were killed by gunfire from people in a vehicle described as like a Seat. 9:30, a second explosion from a suicide bomber by Gate H of the stadium. 2 minutes later, at 9:32, another attack, this time at La Bonne Bière bar on the corner of Rue Fontenoy and Rue Faubourg du Temple. A further 5 people are killed. According to the first testimonies, those attackers were also in a black vehicle described as like a Seat. At 9:36, gunmen in a similar vehicle opened fire at La Belle Équipe bar at 92 Rue de Charon. 19 people were killed. 4 minutes later, at 9:40, a suicide bomber detonates their vest at the Comptoir Voltaire Café at 253 Boulevard Voltaire. At the same time, 3 gunmen emerged from a black Volkswagen Polo outside the Bataclan concert venue just down the road at number 50. They entered the concert hall during a performance by US rock band Eagles of Death Metal. At 9:53, some 13 minutes later, an explosion from another suicide bomber goes off, about 400 meters from Stade de France on Rue de la Coquerie. At 11:20, French police launched an assault to free hostages at Bataclan. The 3 gunmen killed 89 people. The greatest number of victims were at the front of the stage.
This is an act of war that was prepared, organized, and planned abroad with the complicity of people here.
It is clear that the threat from ISIL is evolving. Last night's attacks suggest a new degree of planning and coordination and a greater ambition for mass casualty attacks.
I call on the entire civilized world to unite to defeat the plague of worldwide terrorism. An attack on any one of us should be seen as an attack on all of us.
This is an attack not just on Paris, it's an attack not just on the people of France, but this is an attack on all of humanity and the universal values that we share.
Our investigation will try and identify the attackers, their accomplices, those who gave them orders, and their course.
Seront prises. L'état d'urgence sera décrété. L'état d'urgence, lui, sera proclamé sur l'ensemble du territoire. La seconde décision que j'ai prise, c'est la fermeture des frontières. Nous devons nous assurer que personne ne pourra rentrer pour commettre quelque acte que ce soit. Et en même temps que ceux qui auraient pu commettre les crimes qui sont, hélas, constatés puissent également être appréhendés s'ils devaient sortir du territoire.
Le hasard a fait, pour vous dire, c'est que le matin, au SAMU de Paris, avait été organisé un exercice sur des attentats multisites. Donc on était préparés. Donc ce qu'il faut voir, c'est que vous avez une mobilisation des forces de police, des pompiers, des SAMU, des associatifs qui sont venus, et on a essayé de sauver le plus de monde possible.
Cette soirée, en fait, elle a commencé le matin. Commencé le matin parce que le matin, nous répétions l'exercice, exactement le scénario qui s'est produit le soir.
Attendez, le matin, vous aviez un exercice
oui.
En conditions réelles au cas où il y a un attentat. Et vous ne pouviez pas imaginer que le soir même, ça arriverait, mais en conditions réelles. Alors ça vous a énormément servi ou...
Le SAMU avait organisé un exercice sur des attentats multisites.
Marina, c'est quelque chose qui, lorsqu'on l'évoque maintenant, paraît irréel. Une simulation de pratiquement ce qui s'est passé le soir même.
Ça veut dire quoi? Qu'on savait, on vous alertait parce qu'on pensait qu'il pouvait y avoir une fusillade?
Now to talk about what he's actually saying. He says that he quotes a guest on a French radio station who explains that as luck would... Now to talk about what he's actually saying. He says that he quotes a guest on a French radio station who explains that as luck would...
This is 9/11 question.
The question was, we had 4 war games going on September 11th, and the question that I tried to pose before the Secretary had to go to lunch was whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response. In fact, General Eberhart, who was then the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, as he testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, I believe he told them that it enhanced our ability to respond. These are command post exercises. What that means is all the battle positions that are normally not filled are indeed filled. So it was an easy transition from an exercise into a real-world situation. It actually enhanced the response. Otherwise, it would take somewhere between 30 minutes and a couple of hours to fill those positions, those battle spaces, with the right staff officers.
Mr. Chair.
Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team. And the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real. And one of the first things is get that bureau number. When you have a list of people missing, tell them. And it took a long time.
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario?
Almost precisely.
This is interesting. Before the marathon, he saw bomb-sniffing dogs and bomb spotters on the roofs at the starting line, and it appeared to him there was some sort of active threat before the explosions went off.
At the start line this morning, they had bomb spotters on the roofs of the building, and they had bomb-sniffing dogs coming up and down at the start line, and Melanie said there was bomb-sniffing dogs at the finish line, but they kept making announcements saying to the participants, do not worry, this is just a training exercise. Well, evidently I don't believe they were just having a training exercise. I think they must have known, they must have had some kind of threats or suspicions called in.
Another development on Saturday, New York officials revealed at a news conference here in the city that a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
And back at FBI headquarters, Socklaban administers a room full of details.
We found this passport, which is one of the alleged hijackers. What was left of it shows us his photograph.
We have since found personal documents bearing the names of 3 of those 4 men close to the seats of 3 of the explosions.
A national identity card was found in the getaway car used by the gunman who attacked the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo, French officials said Thursday. The document carried the name of 34-year-old Saeed Kouachi, a man with no police record, officials said.
The Syrian passport that was found on one of those suicide bombers who intervened at the very start of all this.
German Interior Minister Thomas de Maizière has said that the Syrian passport found next to one of the suicide bombers in the Paris terror attacks is likely to have been planted. The finding has raised suspicion that it was a deliberate attempt to blame refugees and make people feel unsafe, de Maizière said.
Failed to anticipate this attack, and we'll have to understand why this happened and correct whatever went wrong, and what went wrong big time. The second item is a very difficult one, and that is the level of sophistication and expertise of this attack is really rather scary.
Just from what we do know, it's very clear that they were sophisticated.
The moment the world realized that the group is a global threat. It's a level of sophistication that took the Obama administration by surprise.
But in terms of how sophisticated this was, or whether, given the methodology used, you would consider it to be a fairly low level of sophistication, where do you put it on that spectrum?
No, I think that it's a fairly high level of sophistication.
We don't know for sure, but it looks like this was planned, organized, directed from Iraq and Syria. So that first, that point makes this complicated, right? Second is you're moving operatives around. You've got a large number of operatives. They have to get explosives. They have to get weapons. They have to communicate among themselves and communicate back to Iraq and Syria. That is a level of sophistication that we have not seen since the London bombings in 2005.
When I think about what happened in Paris, clearly there was an effort that was underway for quite some time that was fairly sophisticated because of the nature of the attacks in terms of their simultaneous nature.
At the end of the Second World War, President Roosevelt traveled to the Great Bitter Lake in the middle of the Suez Canal. At the same time, he sent another American warship to pick up the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz. As Roosevelt sat waiting for Abdulaziz, no one could possibly have imagined the consequences of this meeting. America needed oil, and he wanted to forge an alliance with the king to make sure that the vast Saudi oil fields remained under American control. In their conversation, the two men laid the foundations for an alliance that continues to the present day. America would get its oil, and in return, Saudi Arabia would receive wealth and security from America. But the king was well aware of the dangers of opening up his country to the influence of the modern West. And in the negotiations that followed, he laid down a condition. "We will take your technology and your money," he said, "but you must leave our faith alone." The Saudi faith was called Wahhabism. It was a radical, violent, and extremely puritanical form of Islam. And its followers among the Bedouin tribes hated the modern world. Wahhabism was part of a wider movement in Islam that had risen up in reaction to the European empires. Another was the Deobandi movement in India. They all believed that modern imperialism was corrupting the true nature of Islam and wanted to go back to a world based on the original teachings of the Islamic texts. Abdulaziz had harnessed this force in the 1920s to seize power. But he had unleashed something that didn't want to stop. The Wahhabists wanted to go on and create a caliphate across the whole of the Arab world. And to stop them, in 1929, Abdulaziz machine-gunned them. He ruthlessly killed the warriors who had made him king. But their belief, a violent, intolerant, and above all backward-looking version of Islam, remained at the heart of Saudi Arabian society. And the deal made that day on the Great Bitter Lake meant that America would get its oil, but it would also be protecting Wahhabism, a force that had its own global ambitions. Ambitions that were very different from America's. President Reagan simplified everything for America. For 10 years, the country had been battered and torn apart by waves of economic and social chaos. Reagan set out to give the country a new sense of purpose. He took all the problems, even the most complex, and turned them into reassuring moral fables. And abroad, the world he depicted was one where, although good might struggle with evil for a while, in the end, goodness and innocence would triumph. Conflicts that in the past would have been seen as political struggles were redefined. They became instead battles against dark demonic forces that threatened innocent people. And the role of we, the good people of the West, was to intervene to save those innocents. One of the places this dream began was Afghanistan. But right from the beginning, there was a dangerous, destructive force at the very heart of this project. This was because Reagan's partner in the battle to bring freedom to Afghanistan was Saudi Arabia. The Saudi intelligence agencies worked with the CIA to ship arms and money to the Afghan rebels. On the surface, the Saudis did this because a fellow Muslim country had been invaded by communists. But it was also part of their attempt to export the dangerous fundamentalism at the heart of their own society. They encouraged young radicals to go and fight in Afghanistan. One of them was a young Osama bin Laden. The aim was to divert their anger. But it meant that with the arms would also come the pessimistic and intolerant version of Islam, Wahhabism. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the leaders of Saudi Arabia realized that despite all this hardware, all the planes, the missiles, the bombs, and the radar systems, that their country was incapable of using it properly to defend itself against Saddam Hussein. So they had to turn to America and its military might for help.
In my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland.
Osama bin Laden had returned from Afghanistan, and he went to see the Saudi defense minister and pleaded with him not to let the Americans come. He offered to raise a force of Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan and bring them to defend Saudi Arabia instead. But the defense minister turned him down. And within weeks, over 500,000 American soldiers had arrived in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden saw it as the corrupt takeover by the West of the very heart of Islam. When the Russians left Afghanistan, the different Mujahideen groups turned on each other and began a vicious struggle for power. Kabul was completely destroyed as the different groups fired thousands of rockets indiscriminately into the heart of the city. And Kabul became a living hell. Out of the chaos came two extreme and violent reactions. Both ruthlessly simplified the world, and both, although they were completely contradictory, were rooted in Wahhabism, the intolerant fundamentalism that came from Saudi Arabia. One was the Taliban. The other reaction came from Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had come back to Afghanistan, determined to lead an Islamist revolution. But his ideas were very different from the Taliban. He wanted to use Islamic principles in a new way, to make it a revolutionary force in the modern world. To go forwards, not backwards. Bin Laden's Islamist ideas began to mutate and become mixed with the intolerant and anti-modern anger of Wahhabism. Out of it came a dark and apocalyptic jihadism. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had gone to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets back in the 1980s. Then he had stayed on to work with Osama bin Laden. And in 2003, he went to Iraq and set up a jihadist group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq to fight the American invasion. He was convinced that the insurgency in Iraq could be used to spread an Islamist revolution throughout the Arab world. In 2013, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant was formed, known as ISIS in the West. Its aim is to create a unified caliphate throughout the Islamic world. And although it uses the techniques of modern media, it is at heart the same violent dream that had driven the Bedouins who had created the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the 1920s. Back then, the King of Saudi Arabia had found it necessary to try and exterminate them, because they too wanted to go on and conquer the whole of the Islamic world. He machine-gunned them in the bleak sands of the Arabian Peninsula. And now, the Saudis, along with the British and the Americans, are trying to do the same thing again, to kill the jihadists and their ideas in the sand dunes of northern Iraq and Syria.
Repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly.
When George W. Bush took office in 2000, he brought with him Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary for Defense Paul Wolfowitz, all of whom had served together previously in the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, working in the Department of Defense, was asked to write the first draft of a new national security strategy, a document entitled the Defense Planning Guidance. The most controversial elements of what would later come to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine were that the United States should dramatically increase defense spending, that it should be willing to take preemptive military action, and that it should be willing to use military force unilaterally, with or without allies. This new reliance on military force was necessary, according to Wolfowitz, to prevent the emergence of any future or potential rivals to American power, and to secure access to vital resources, especially Persian Gulf oil. In 2000, they would craft yet another proposed national security strategy, this one published by a right-wing think tank calling itself the Project for the New American Century. At its core, the document revived the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It called on the United States to increase the military budget by up to $100 billion, to deny other nations the use of outer space, and to adopt a more aggressive and unilateral foreign policy that would allow the United States to act offensively and preemptively in the world. The elimination of states like Iraq figured prominently in this grand vision. In their defining document, written in September of 2000, a full year before 9/11, they acknowledged that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent, in their own chilling words, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later, that event would arrive.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you, but there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use force in the region.
When the Americans landed in Iraq in late March 2003 and overthrew a system, it wasn't just an issue of regime change. They overturned a decades or even a centuries-old system of power, privilege, and patronage.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
لحظة سقوط تمثال صدام حسين بترمز بشكل جيد إن ذاك التمثال بالذات وهو في طريقه للسقوط أمن الخليج الإقليمي كله. إلى يعني سحبوا كله معه أو معه.
The US-led invasion of Iraq took just 6 weeks to bring Saddam Hussein's 24-year rule to an iconic end.
Other nations in history have fought in foreign lands and remain to occupy and exploit. Americans, following a battle, want nothing more than to return home.
It would be another 8 years before US troops would leave Iraq.
The country was run by one person, Saddam Hussein. Then you remove that person and not attending to the country for more than 100 days. It amounts to be a gross negligence by the American administration then.
Ali Kederi was special advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority, the US-dominated body tasked with governing an increasingly violent Iraq. As head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, Paul Jerry Bremer's first official order was to ban the deposed Ba'ath Party in all forms. It was a decision that both the and Iraqis would come to regret.
Disbanding the army and setting up the De-Baathification Commission, which became a tool of political vengeance in Ahmed Chalabi's hands. We never recovered from those things because hundreds of thousands of people became unemployed, disillusioned, disenfranchised, and took to insurgency.
Very interesting question is this holy, unholy alliance between Baathism and I would say Wahhabism.
Two disaffected constituencies who had been mortal enemies for many years had finally decided that they had some common ground. And it was, just a variation on the ancient mantra of my enemy's enemy is my friend.
They aligned what was supposed to be a temporary alliance to try to, again, bleed and exhaust the United States or its so-called puppets in Baghdad.
The improvised nature of Sunni attacks now combined with the Ba'athist know-how, the insurgency moved to a new scale of terror. The US invasion of Iraq had spawned two insurgencies, igniting an increasingly sectarian conflict. No one embraced the apocalyptic vision of a Sunni-Shia war more than the man used to justify American aggression.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
They were talking about Zarqawi as being this potent force, and he in fact wasn't the force that he turned out to be a couple of years later.
From his terrorist network in Iraq, Zarqawi can direct his network in the Middle East and beyond.
Contrary to American claims, the Jordanian Zarqawi had no formal alignment with al-Qaeda or its leadership before 2003. A year later, with coalition troops in control of Iraq, the once lone wolf jihadists had become the figurehead of the Sunni insurgency.
His group of Tawheed al-Jihad acknowledged the leadership of al-Qaeda and Zawahiri and rebranded itself as al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. And at that point, he became, as it were, the poster boy of the insurgency. And for a while, his antics and his extreme violence began to cast, as it were, a shadow on all the other insurgent groups.
He was trying to portray himself as a Rambo of the Muslim world. Zarqawi revolutionized the ideology of al-Qaeda. See, al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri was built on anti-Americanism. Now, Zarqawi started to introduce the sectarian element of it, which is anti-Shia element. And once the sectarian war erupted, then you get a failed dysfunctional state, and this is the best environment the jihadists will work.
A year after claiming Iraq had ties to al-Qaeda, America's falsehood became a self-fulfilling prophecy, with Zarqawi center stage.
So he became like Al Capone, public enemy number one. It became very easy then to focus all attention to being a very small but extremely violent group whose acts are far louder and create a much bigger bang than their reality.
A man named Zarqawi is responsible for planting car bombs and beheading Americans. He swore his allegiance to Osama bin Laden. Our troops will defeat Zarqawi and his likes overseas in Iraq so we do not have to face them here at home.
The news that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the top
After this, catching Zarqawi, the #1 bad guy in country.
Musab al-Zarqawi is responsible for...
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi have claimed responsibility for many of the beheadings and bombings in Iraq.
The focus was on Zarqawi as an individual, and the way that the media works and the way that the US wanted to portray the insurgency was by limiting it to the acts of a mad, insane terrorist who has this bloodlust.
By April of 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was fighting both an insurgency and a sectarian war, leaving the country awash with blood. An emboldened Abu Musab al-Zarqawi issued his first public statement in a video warning George W. Bush of greater violence to come. A month after Iraq's first democratic elections, Zarqawi was killed in a US airstrike.
By that point, he had ignited a full-blown sectarian war. Iraq was out of control. There were 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per month for the best part of 9 months of that year, and the country looked completely beyond any hope at all. The Sunni insurgency was raging. There were a number of leaders around the country who could step up and take his place, and several in fact did.
Stepping up to fill the void at the top of Al-Qaeda in Iraq was one of its founders, Abu Ayyub al-Masri. By October 2006, the group had merged with other Sunni insurgents. Al-Masri announced the formation of a new entity, the Islamic State of Iraq, and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi as its emir. It was a bullish move that forced the American occupiers into a dramatic shift.
America will change our strategy to help the Iraqis carry out their campaign to put down sectarian violence and bring security to the people of Baghdad.
The so-called awakening, the Sahwa, that saw Sunni tribes unite against the newly announced Islamic State of Iraq, was supported by a surge of US troops. The goal was simple: wipe out the insurgency.
By January 2007, there was a strategic cooperation between the tribes and the Americans, and that was then used to try and get on the front foot for the first time in several years. At the same time, Zarqawi's replacement, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, had stepped up and was starting to try and assert his will across an insurgency which for the first time was under some serious threat.
It seemed like a winning strategy, but in a rapidly failing state, the line between ally and enemy was increasingly blurred.
Ironically, some of these guys were the same guys that were already fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in preceding years. So it's a very complicated situation where we were allying with essentially Al-Qaeda affiliated groups to fight Al-Qaeda on the pretext that they weren't actually Al-Qaeda, but they were only Al-Qaeda affiliated. And we were just pouring money into this.
People thought that was the end of the Islamic State. At least that is what we were led to believe. Many of its leaders were apprehended, some killed, but mainly apprehended, and then incarcerated in a camp in southern Iraq called Camp Baka.
By the end of 2007, after the death of almost 100,000 Iraqi civilians and over 4,000 coalition troops, the prevailing narrative was of a fatally weakened Islamic State of Iraq.
What Camp Buka and other military facilities ended up being luxury radicalization centers.
They were the best environment, the best school, where the jihadists were trained and taught.
Camp Buka became an incubator for an insurgency. It was the Sunnis who used this long period of internment to instill some kind of an ideological fever, a battle readiness into those who felt the indignity of actually being taken there, and also there were numerous leaders who were committed to an ideological cause, who did buy into the preordained worldview that this was an existential fight against a mortal foe.
Told them several times on record, this is going to be a real time bomb in future. And all of a sudden they were in a hurry to release them. And in a few weeks' time, they released more than 100,000.
Statistics are that 18 of the 27 senior ISIS leaders were all veterans of Camp Bukka, and I think that speaks for itself.
Journalist Martin Chuloff witnessed firsthand the Baghdad ministry bombings in August 2009. They proved that the US troop surge and so-called awakening of Sunni tribes hadn't stopped the Islamic State of Iraq from striking at the heart of Iraqi power. Iraqi power was soon to strike back.
Iraqi security forces, with the support of U.S. forces, killed the two most senior leaders of al-Qaeda Iraq, Abu Ayyub al-Mazari and Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, executed terrorist attacks against the Iraqis in the recent past, as well as against Americans.
Just as in 2006, after the assassination of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, it wasn't long before a new leader emerged to head the Sunni insurgency, a man the Americans knew all about.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a young Islamic cleric with a direct lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad, who'd been trained at an Islamic university in Baghdad.
Arrested in Fallujah by US forces in February 2004, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was detained at the US-run Camp Bukka prison as part of the mass internment program. But in the spring of 2011, events outside of Iraq would change the stakes for the entire region. What began as a peaceful protest against the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad mutated into an armed insurrection. But was this mutation steered by external forces?
L'Angleterre préparait l'invasion des rebelles en Syrie.
The involvement of the US and Britain could have begun as early as 2009, according to Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister.
Mais c'est pour dire que cette opération vient de très loin. Elle a été préparée, conçue dans le but très simple, mais le but très simple, de destituer le gouvernement syrien parce que...
WikiLeaks also obtained a bulk of emails from Stratfor, where we have conversations amongst senior Stratfor executives talking about various meetings that they had had in around 2011 with senior US Air Force intelligence officers and other Pentagon officials who confirmed that they already had British and American special forces on the ground in Syria training rebel groups, and that they were actively thinking about how they could destabilize the Assad regime from within.
The emails obtained by WikiLeaks revealed information shared by US Air Force strategists with the American intelligence firm Stratfor. British journalist Nafiz Ahmed examined declassified government papers and leaked documents to unravel the nexus of world powers staking a claim in Syria's turmoil.
The US and British and French governments were looking at allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, even Israel and Jordan. We had this network of countries in the region who were part of this kind of command and control structure. Part of what was described as a kind of a weapons bridge as to making decisions as to which rebels would receive arms. And every single year we had these CIA assessments that were coming out saying that basically the vast majority of the opposition groups that are receiving support are basically Islamist militants and linked to jihadist groups. And every year these assessments got worse and worse and worse.
تكفيريون إرهابيون يحملون فكر القاعدة يسمون أنفسهم جهاديين جاءوا من كل حدب وصوب يقودون العمليات الإرهابية على الأرض.
ISIL came at a great time for the Syrian regime because the supporters of the Assad regime, Iran and Russia, were always saying, these are terrorists, these are not opposition.
The rise of the Islamist factions played into his hands, gave him the opportunity to use the same kind of dangerous rhetoric that the West has used in the war on terror, saying we're fighting terrorists and using it to crack down in a very brutal way. And, you know, obviously he was killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, you know, indiscriminately.
It's just not conceivable that the highly dramatic killings of dozens of people is going to lead to the rise of a bloodthirsty terrorist movement. There was a great deal of organizational work being done by ISIL to build its base in this period. And they didn't just, you know, pop up like Venus out of a shell in the sea. I have no doubt that agents provocateurs were involved in a lot of these events.
The Islamic State of Iraq now waged war across two fronts, Iraq and Syria. Its strategy in Iraq remained guerrilla insurrection and suicide bomb attacks. In Syria, it was to move to a whole new level of warfare.
As the war deteriorated, the factionalization increased. Islamic State really emerged as the most significant victor from that.
Shiraz Maher of King's College London maintained close contacts with fighters traveling to Syria to join up with the Islamic State of Iraq.
It attracted the largest number of recruits, it had the largest number of resources, and they brought in a lot of fighters from the Balkans and from Chechnya. And what that allowed them to do was to develop the most powerful, most vital, most crucial asset that any army has, and that is fighters with combat experience.
Whilst the Western media focused on recruits from their own nations, the Islamic State of Iraq attracted thousands of seasoned fighters from Central Asia, North Africa, and across the Middle East. The Islamic State of Iraq had won the power struggle between insurgent groups. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi dismissed al-Qaeda's authority and claimed Syria's insurgent group Jabhat al-Nusra had joined his ranks. The new entity would have a new name, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. Just 6 months after overwhelming Iraqi security forces in Fallujah, ISIL set its sights on Iraq's second largest city, Mosul. What happened next would send shockwaves throughout Iraq.
500 to 600 ISIL forces drove their trucks into the city of Mosul. 6 divisions of the Iraqi army, roughly 120,000 men, melted like the snow. ISIL were able to seize 6 divisions worth of strategic weaponry, all of it US supplied, all of it modern. They had at least 250 Humvees, 200 troop carriers as well. They had 30-odd M1 Abrams tanks, and enough weaponry to supply any modern army for many years.
We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy.
12 years on from declaring a so-called war on terror, an American president leading a multinational coalition that included the Gulf countries as well as Turkey, once more announced a new campaign to combat the same scourge. The rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant exposed the unresolved rifts in the region's politics. Enemies of old were being drawn deeper into a new web of tangled interests, and at its center lay ISIL.
ISIL is a significant player, I believe, in the array of alliances against Iran. So it's seen by the United States, it's seen by Israel and by Saudi Arabia as a potential weapon against further Iranian advances in the area. And it's seen to be a winning ticket, that you can mobilize sentiment.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implication. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
It's important to clearly understand the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is about as Federal Express. It makes its own policies and is under virtually no regulation by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all the currency at interest to the government, completely consistent with the fraudulent central banking model that the country sought to escape from when it declared independence in the American Revolutionary War. Now, the control of the economy and the perpetual robbery of wealth is only one side of the Rubik's Cube the bankers hold in their hands. The next tool for profit and control is war. Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a number of large and small wars have commenced. The 3 most pronounced were World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. World War I. In 1914, European wars broke out centered around England and Germany. The American public wanted nothing to do with the war. In turn, President Woodrow Wilson publicly declared neutrality. However, under the surface, the U.S. administration was looking for any excuse it could find to enter it. In a noted observation by Secretary of State William Jennings, the large banking interests were deeply interested in the World War because of the wide opportunities for large profits. It's important to understand that the most lucrative thing that can happen for the international bankers is war, for it forces the country to borrow even more money from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest. Woodrow Wilson's top advisor and mentor was Colonel Edward House, a man with intimate connections with the international bankers who wanted in the war. In a documented conversation between Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of England, regarding how to get America into the war, Grey inquired, "What will Americans do if Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" House responded, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war. So, on May 7, 1915, on essentially the suggestion of Sir Edward Grey, a ship called the Lusitania was deliberately sent into German-controlled waters where German military vessels were known to be. And, as expected, German U-boats torpedoed the ship, exploding stored ammunition, killing 1,200 people. In turn, and as anticipated, the sinking of the Lusitania caused a wave of anger among the American population, and America entered the war a short time after. The First World War caused 323,000 American deaths. J.D. Rockefeller made $200 million off of it. Not to mention the war cost about $30 billion for America, most of which was borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest, furthering the profits of the international bankers. World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering our entry into that war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared the attack was a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is clear that not only was the attack on Pearl Harbor known weeks in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. Roosevelt, whose family had been New York bankers since the 18th century, whose uncle Frederick was on the original Federal Reserve Board, was very sympathetic to the interests of the international bankers, and the interest was to enter the war, as we've seen, nothing is more profitable for international bankers than war. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how should we maneuver them into firing the first shot? It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who were the aggressors. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan's imports of American petroleum. He froze all the Japanese assets in the United States. He made public loans to nationalist China and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan in the war, which, by the way, is completely in violation of international war rules. And on December 4th, 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence told Roosevelt about a Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt ignored it. So, as hoped and allowed, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 83% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered for the war. It is important to note, Nazi Germany's war effort was largely supported by two organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives, and even the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps to kill millions. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in America. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The drastic bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by a $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben by the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did it finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed for having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violations of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush. Keep that in mind when considering the moral and political dispositions of the Bush family. Vietnam. The United States' official declaration of war on North Vietnam in 1964 came after an alleged incident involving two U.S. destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This single situation was the catalytic pretext for massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however, the attack on the U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese PT boats never happened. It was a completely staged event to have an excuse to enter the war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake while many other insiders and officers have come forward, relaying that it was a contrived farce, a complete lie. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trading restrictions on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnam's war supplies. Consequently, Rockefeller interests financed factories in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and send it to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides of this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. This detailed what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included absurdities like North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile systems could not be bombed until they were known to be fully operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia. And most revealing of all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these imposed ludicrous limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on so long. And the bottom line is this: the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese. So, where are we now? September 11th was the jumpstart for what is now an accelerated agenda by the ruthless elite. It was a staged war pretext no different than the sinking of the Lusitania, the provoking of Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin lie. In fact, if 9/11 wasn't a planned war pretext, it would be an exception to the rule.
Already, the meeting in the White House over 2 years ago, everyone in the National Security Team recommended arming ISIS.
Really comes down to whether or not we can convince the Arab world to go in there and defeat these guys.
It really comes down to building a coalition so that what the Arab Muslim world sees is them rejecting ISIS, not
They
us
already
defeating
reject ISIL. Do you know any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL?
I know major Arab allies who fund them.
Yeah, but did they embrace that? They fund them because the Free Syrian Army couldn't fight Assad. They were trying to beat Assad.
Одной из угроз это ИГИЛ. Ну а кто помогал вооружать людей, которые в Сирии боролись с Асадом-то? Кто создавал благоприятный политический информационный климат? Кто подталкивал к поставкам оружия, месторождения нефтяные, там, скажем, где-то в Ираке или в Сирии? Нефть начали добывать? У них эту нефть покупают, транспортируют, продают. Почему санкции не накладывают на всех, кто это делает? А что, разве Соединенные Штаты не знают, кто это делает?
mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded. Let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam.
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting.
So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
Well, all along there's always been the idea that Turkey was supporting ISIS in some way. We know they've funneled people going through Turkey to ISIS. Someone's buying that oil that ISIS is selling. It's going through somewhere. It looks to me like it's probably going through Turkey.
The so-called Islamic State makes an estimated $500 million a year from oil. That's nearly $1.5 million every day. It's no accident. IS have strategically identified and targeted oil as a source of income. IS-controlled territory now includes many major oil fields and refineries across Syria and Iraq, some of which you can see here, producing up to an estimated 40,000 barrels per day. So where do they sell them? Syria President Bashar al-Assad has long been accused of buying IS oil through middlemen. War requires fuel, and IS controls most of Syria's fuel. But Vladimir Putin alleges that Turkey is also involved.
We've received more information showing that the oil controlled by IS and other terrorist organizations is being delivered in huge quantities on an industrial scale to Turkey.
Turkey categorically denies this.
Well, now the mainstream media is being forced to take a closer look at Islamic State's main source of revenue. ISIS makes nearly $500 million a year in illicit oil trade. And who's buying the oil? Turkey, Israel. We decided to take a closer look at exactly who is facilitating the transport of the stolen crude and where it ultimately ends up. On Friday, we highlighted an academic study by George Kirkskalu and Dr. Alec Trubis, who took a look at tanker rates at Seyhan in Turkey around significant oil-related events involving ISIS. And here's what they found. In their words, it seems that whenever the Islamic State is fighting in the vicinity of an area hosting oil assets, the exports from Seyhan promptly spike. This may be attributed to an extra boost given to crude oil smuggling with the aim of immediately generating additional funds, badly needed for the supply of ammunition and military equipment. Now you can begin to see the connection. Seyhan is the port from which Kurdish oil, technically illegal, is transported, and as Kirkskalu and Trubis note, the quantities of crude oil that are being exported to the terminal in Seyhan, Turkey, exceed the mark of 1 million barrels per day, and given that ISIS has never been able to trade daily more than 45,000 barrels of oil, it becomes evident that the detection of similar quantities of smuggled crude cannot take place through stock accounting methods. In other words, if ISIS oil was being shipped from Seyhan, it would essentially be invisible. Except there's satellite images, which I will reveal later. Here's where things get interesting. A few weeks ago, Reuters released an exclusive report detailing how Erbil hides its crude shipments from Baghdad. Most customers were scared of touching it, with Baghdad threatening to sue any buyer. Large oil companies, including ExxonMobil and BP, have billions of dollars worth of joint projects with Baghdad. Okay, so a scheme involving ship-to-ship transfers off the coast of Malta was used to get Kurdish crude to places like Israel. Israeli refineries and oil companies imported more than 19 million barrels of Kurdish oil between the beginning of May and August 11th, according to shipping data, trading sources, and satellite tanker tracking, FT reported last week. That is the equivalent of about 77% of average Israeli demand, which runs at roughly 240,000 barrels per day. More than a third of all the northern Iraqi exports, which are shipped from Turkey's Mediterranean port of Sayhan, went to Israel over the period. At this juncture, we begin to get an idea of what's going on here. Kurdish oil is already technically illegal, and Turkey is happy to facilitate its trip to foreign buyers via Sayhan. What better way for ISIS to get its own oil to market than by moving it through a port that already deals in suspect crude? While the graphic shows the crude going directly from Sayhan to Ashdod, it's worth asking whether ISIS crude is also laundered through the same Malta connection utilized by those smuggling illegal Kurdish crude, which also ends up in Israel. We ask that because, as it turns out, Bilal Erdogan owns a Maltese shipping company, the BMZ Group, a company owned by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's son. Bilal, alongside other family members, has purchased 2 tankers in the last 2 months at a total cost of $36 million. Today's Zaman reported in September. Here's a look at the recent port data from Sayhan and Ashdod via fleetmon.com. Malta-flagged oil vessels are highlighted. This week at a press conference in Moscow, Russia's defense ministry presented several photographs and video taken from the sky and from space. They showed large numbers of cars and trucks in formation in the sands of eastern Syria, in neat columns along desert roads, clustered at official crossing points along the Turkish-Syrian border, and parked in orderly rows near port cities on Turkey's Mediterranean coast. Some of these scenes are hundreds of miles apart. Anatoly Antonov, one of Russia's 9 deputy defense ministers, said that the images constitute hard evidence that there is a single team acting in the region, composed of criminals and Turkish elites who are buying oil from ISIS on an industrial scale.